think we hurt ourselves a lot by, first of all, being very slow to sort of cop to this thing called the internet. You know, we were so fat and happy. We had a lot of revenue. We just couldn't imagine that it would go away. And so it was we were very slow to realize that nothing was going to turn back the tide of the internet. And then, as I said, the decision, the sort of industry-wide decision to make our content free, I think was unwise, to say the least. So would that have saved the newspaper industry? You know, probably not. It's, you know, it's not too much. I mean, it is a technology that's really about another century, and it's not how we, you know, I mean, I take the subway a lot in New York City, and you know, people are just on their phones. That's how we take in information now. So I think we probably could have, it could have been less disastrous, but I don't think we were ever going to, you know, maintain the level of success that we once had. It probably could have been slowed, and maybe during that time when it was slowed, we could have figured out how to, you know, how to make a better transition and how to walk across that bridge from analog to digital. But we didn't do that, and that was, you know, I think tragic. The thing is, there has to be a piecemeal approach. It can't just be people like the Sandlers or people like Craig Newmark or whoever it may be saying, here's a bunch of money, now you're good. It doesn't work that way. And as we found out on the national front with news organizations, including, you know, I mean, almost every digital site you can think of, they too have had trouble. It's not just about local. I think there has to be an involvement by the readership or by the consumer so that there's a kind of a membership model. We have to get people to understand that if you want quality news, and if you want news that's been vetted and that isn't full of misinformation and that can help you make your way in an uncertain world, you're going to have to pay for it. And so, yes, philanthropy, yes, events like the one that we attended in Austin, the Trib Fest, you know, philanthropy, events, membership, subscriptions, there needs to be a lot of different stuff working. And I also think that there is still advertising that comes to news organizations such as newspapers, and the fact that, you know, newspapers do still exist, and most of them are profitable, believe it or not. There's advertising there that needs to be sustained. So it's not just one thing, it's a lot of different things, and there's, you know, depending on which organization, which community you're in, it's a different sort of balance. Well, some of it is making sure that the news organizations, like the ones I've mentioned, are, you know, remain profitable. The Buffalo News has a union. They actually just today, I believe, got a 3-year contract approved, and that's great. Many news organizations have become unionized, and you know, I think that's a part of it too. You can't expect extremely talented young people to stay in a profession indefinitely where they're not really going to be able to make any money, maybe have a family or live the way they want to live, even if it's not hugely rich. They need to be able to make a living. I will say that I follow the careers because I've taught for a long time, and also I'm lucky enough just to know a lot of young journalists, including my nephew, a former college roommate of my daughter's, a former girlfriend of my son's. You know, I just know a lot of young journalists, and I'm really impressed with the work they're doing, and I'm impressed with the way they have been able to progress in their careers. You know, one of them works for an NBC affiliate in Philadelphia. One of them works for Axios in Washington, D.C. on and on. So I think that churn that you're talking about does exist, and I think unions are a part of it. And I'm also heartened by the fact that I do know a lot of young journalists who are doing pretty well. I mean, if you're interested enough in a story, you will read it at almost any length. And the thing is, not every story can be the same length. I do think there's a role for long-form journalism, absolutely. And I also think there's a role for, and I mentioned Axios, where my nephew works, that's basically journalism done in bullet points. I mean, we do have short attention spans, and while we might make fun of that, you know, that's not journalism, that's bullet points. It's actually a pretty efficient way to get some information across right away. But then if there's a long-form story about, you know, for example, the Supreme Court, I'm pretty sure people will read it. So there needs to be a mix, and I don't think that the role of long-form journalism will ever go away. So this is, you know, really I could have spent the entire time talking about this subject. And my second book, which is called Newsroom Confidential, has a chapter called The Objectivity Wars. And there is a big debate in journalism about objectivity. You know, why should, but you might ask, why should we be debating something that's so obviously good? Don't we want objective news? Yes, of course we do. But I think that the debate is about something sort of different. It's about a couple of different things. One of the things it's about is that there is an interpretation of objectivity that ends up being what we might call both sidesism. You know, well, we don't really know, so we're going to take everything down the middle. There's two candidates. One of them is kind of a traditional pro-democracy person. The other one wants to overthrow a legitimate election. So let's just treat those the same, you know. The other term for that is false equivalency. So if that's the way you want to debate, if that's the way you want to define objectivity, then it needs to be rethought for sure. Our role is actually to try to get to the truth and to get to reality, not to represent both sides equally when both sides are not equally valid. So I've gotten to a point where I don't really like to use the word objectivity, even though I think the objective method, which is that you go into a story with an open mind and you do the reporting and you report against your own biases, that's all very good. So if we're talking about a method of objectivity, that's great and we need to keep it. But because everyone gets a little crazy about that word, I think that words that make people less crazy and still get the job done are the ones, some of the ones you mentioned: fairness, accuracy, truth. So, you know, those things, I think the reporting has to support those things. So, I mean, there's also a whole school of thought about, you know, okay, we've had objectivity in the past, but sort of whose objectivity was it? You know, was it a framing that was done by, you know, people who weren't necessarily like me, you know? And so those questions arise too. So, you know, I do think that the objective method is really important. I would never want to throw that away. I don't think journalists should be activists, except in searching for the truth and in you know, I think that journalists can absolutely stand up for some things. They can stand up for civil rights. They can stand up for press rights. They can stand up for the truth. I don't think that reporters should take political positions, and I've never thought so. So, you know, all of these things sort of come into play when you start to talk about objectivity. So that's, but the bottom line for me is, yes, use the objective method in reporting, but maybe there's a better way to express it so that you don't get into a pointless argument. Well, you know, democracy dies in darkness. You've probably heard that. I mean, look, that's the motto of the Washington Post, and the author of it, actually, as Marty Barron wrote in his recent book, was the Post's owner, Jeff Bezos. And you know, I think the idea that that the news media, the legit news media, is an important element of democracy is a good one. But we do have a very, very mistrustful, you know, people don't trust the media in general. And so when you start saying, we're the ones who know, we're the ones who can save democracy, it probably adds to that problem. I mean, I think it's worth saying. The expression itself is a little too gothic for me, you know. It sounds a little dark, but you know, the other way to look at it is, you know, and this is sort of a saying in journalism, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. That our job is to cast the light on problems and let people see, and then let the sort of democratic process unfold from there. But you know, we do have a trust problem. We do have a mistrust problem, and I also think that it's a little bit like asking people, you know, if you say to people, do you trust the media? I mean, if you ask me that question, I'm not sure I could say, yeah, absolutely. I'd say, what media? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about Fox News? No, I do not trust Fox News. You know, are we talking about, you know, your local paper? Are we talking about ProPublica? Are we talking about the Texas Tribune? Breitbart? You know, Newsmax? You know, it's hard to say. So I do think that the mistrust issue is a little bit, you can get a little hung up on it. I think it's important for journalists to understand their role in a democracy. And I would actually like to see news leaders throughout the country take it more seriously. Not necessarily in a motto, but in the way they frame stories, in a way they decide what kind of coverage to do. In de-emphasizing horse race coverage and emphasizing the kind of coverage about consequences, about what, you know, how is this presidential election, how important it is that that we think about what the next 4 years are going to be like, and how that affects our democracy. So, yeah, we should be paying attention to democracy. Yes, we should be paying attention to journalism's role in a democracy. I'm not sure that sort of running around saying it as a slogan is always that effective. So, you know, I'm actually doing a big report at the journalism school about the ethics of AI in newsrooms, and we're, you know, doing a really deep dive into the topic. So it's very much on my mind. You know, artificial intelligence has a lot of capabilities, and it has a huge downside. So there have been some really bad screw-ups by news organizations that have decided to use AI and found themselves red-faced because the information is bad. I mean, one thing is that there always needs to be human, at this point, maybe not 10 years from now, but right now, any use of AI in journalism has to have human supervision, the human, you know, the sort of the human involvement. You cannot take what AI produces and put it out there to the world. And at the same time, it has usefulness that can help us. So it's pretty, it's a nuanced topic, and the ethics of it are, you know, developing, but it is here, and it's not just like, oh, it's coming at us. It's already here. People are using it in constructive ways, but I think we need to be really transparent with audiences about when we're using it, fess up when we get something wrong and always have people involved. It cannot be sort of the journalistic version of a self-driving car. I mean, it seems, you know, as a pundit, I can say this: there are too many pundits, and you know, I think opinion journalism and opinion, you know, giving one's opinion as a journalist has some, I think it has some usefulness, but it does seem as though on social media, even regular reporters have become pundits, and that's not healthy. You know, you really, in order to be successful on social media, you're sort of playing to people's emotions. You're not playing to their rationality. And so that, I think, is a problem. So you know, you have all kinds of reporters who you may see on TV, and they're on TV or on social media, and they're giving their opinions, and then you're supposed to think that they're completely legit, you know, fairness and accuracy-based reporters over here. So yes, I do think it's insidious, and at the same time, it's a way to get your work out in front of a new audience. So it kind of, I think it cuts both ways. Well, fact-checking is really important, and it's not enough. So you know, when we have, for example, the disastrous debate of June 27th, which seems like it was, what, 6-7 months ago? What is it, 3 weeks? A lot has happened since then. You know, there was a lot of question about whether the CNN moderators of the Biden-Trump debate should be fact-checking in real time, and the decision was made not to do that fact-checking, that wasn't the role of the moderators. And so as a result, you had Trump just, you know, just lying. I mean, he just got up there and said whatever he wanted to say. And, you know, Biden obviously and clearly had a terrible debate, but he was basically tethered to the truth, and Trump was not. And so if you treat a rally or a speech or a debate without trying to make some effort toward fact-checking while it's going on, and if you say, well, we'll fact check it later, I think it's not very effective. And so, you know, we have a really weird situation right now where we have the leading Republican candidate who is, you know, we know that he is an inveterate and constant liar. And so, you know, there's no question about that. It's not like I'm taking you know, some kind of radical position here. He lies all the time, period. And so, you know, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that in the media? You know, and fact-checking is important. It's good. I'm glad we have it, and I don't think it's enough. And I definitely think that we have to be very careful about broadcasting these rallies or speeches or debates live without some effort to push back with known facts. Yeah, it does, and I mean, it's also extremely annoying to run up against a paywall. I mean, it's a turnoff. You know, you're drawn in by some sort of engaging, clickbaity headline, and you're like, well, yeah, I really want to read that, and then you find out, first of all, you know, well, I won't name any particular news sources, but I'd like to. It's not the Buffalo News, it's the national one. But you know, I will actually resist going on their site because you're immediately bombarded by all these crazy videos and weird pop-up ads and then a paywall. So yes, yes, the answer to that is yes, it's a problem. And yet, we need to find ways to pay for, you know, it's a very expensive, journalism is a very expensive process. Reporters have to be paid. They have to be paid, and so, you know, there are a lot of other expenses too. So, you know, it's one of the really tricky problems that we have. I do think it's good when news organizations say, as they did during the worst of the COVID epidemic, we are going to make this we're going to say that this stuff is outside the paywall because it's really important to people's information. And I've seen that happen a fair amount. I think it's important, it's good. Maybe we need to do more of that. It's a really tricky problem. I mean, I have people saying to me, well, you know, don't post your stuff anywhere, I can't read it. It's behind. Of course, now that I work for The Guardian, which happens to be free to all, although they will tell you they'd like a contribution, but you can read it. And I really love that about working for The Guardian. It's great. And that is done in part because they have a big trust, and they also have been successful about asking people to contribute, explaining the importance of the work, but not saying you may not read this. I mean, you may get you may get something that says, you're reading your 10th free article. Wouldn't you really like to consider maybe starting to pay for this? But yeah, I do think it contributes to inequity. I do think it's a problem, and at the same time, it's really hard to criticize, for example, the Washington Post for having a paywall because they do really important work. It's expensive. It has to be paid for somehow, and that's part of the current business model. This is going to be sheer opinion here, but I think that his decline was fast. It seems like it was fast to me. You know, when you think back just a few months to the State of the Union address, he seemed pretty sharp. And by the time the debate came about, you know, it seemed as though he'd suffered a lot of decline. And obviously, those are different things. Teleprompter, no teleprompter, Trump continuing to talk the whole time while you're trying to debate. I mean, you know, I was critical of this Wall Street Journal piece that said that, a front page piece that said that Biden was slipping badly. And yet it does seem like that story was accurate. The reason I was critical of it, or one of the reasons I was critical, was it was all based on anonymous sources, except for one named source, who was Kevin McCarthy, who, all right. And, you know, I didn't appreciate the way it was reported out, but I think it was ultimately turns out to be accurate. Could Washington reporters, could White House correspondents have dug deeper and reported that out earlier? Yeah, it looks like they could have. And Jill Abramson, the former editor of the New York Times, has been really critical of those Washington reporters for not digging that out earlier. So yeah, I think that's a legit criticism. So I think that local TV and local radio are absolutely extremely important. Very often they take their cues from the newspaper's reporting, and not entirely, but in many cases, and that certainly was true. When I was at the Buffalo News, you know, you would listen to the radio's report in the morning and be like, you could practically hear the newspaper rustling in the background. You know, they really did read well. And so, you know, I think the more that they can do original work, the better, and they absolutely have a role to play. And I think public media has an increasingly important role to play. Public radio has stepped into the breach somewhat in a really good way. So they are important, and Buffalo, I will say, is still extremely lucky because even though the Buffalo News is much smaller in staff than it used to be, I think they still do a lot of important and good work. Very proud to be associated with it still. Actually four television stations, because there's a cable station and 3 local stations. There is radio, and so even though we've suffered quite a bit, I think we still have a pretty reasonable, and Investigative Post, the digital site, I think we have a pretty reasonable sort of media ecosystem, and it's going to take everybody pulling together to keep that going. And again, I will just say that the thing that worries me are the places outside of major cities that have really been left behind by this.